President Trump is back at war with some members of the press, and CNN claims that President Trump says that the press is America's biggest enemy. But did he really say that? Hey everybody, I'm Chad Hasty, host of the Chad Hasty Show, which airs weekday mornings 8:30 to 11 a.m. Central Time on News Talk 95.1 FM and 790 AM KFYO. The headline from CNN: after meeting with North Korean dictator, President Trump calls press America's, quote, biggest enemy. The story here, this is from Brian Stelter over at CNN. He's had a long-running battle with President Trump. Well, I say long-running battle. President Trump really doesn't talk about Stelter. President Trump really goes after Jim Acosta over at CNN, but really never brings up Stelter. But this is what Stelter had to write on CNN.com. Hours after returning from a trip where he lavished praise on one of the world's worst dictators, President News declared that America's biggest enemy is fake news. He singled out NBC and CNN in his angry tweet Wednesday. Trump frequently portrays the news media as one of his enemies, but rarely has he been so blunt about it. Wednesday's tweet harkens back to February 2017 when he called several news outlets the enemy of the American people. He was roundly criticized back then. This time, there's been somewhat of a muted reaction, perhaps because he's repeating himself, but it's important to recognize just how extreme this rhetoric is. No modern American president has publicly spoken about this way about the press. Richard Nixon would sometimes talk this way, but only in private. Quote, never forget the press is the enemy, the press is the enemy, the press is the enemy, Nixon told his advisors, according to Oval Office recordings. Trump relishes the fight, and the story goes on and on and on. But again, here's the headline. After meeting with North Korean dictator, Trump calls press America's, quote, biggest enemy. Now, let's go and see what President Trump actually had to say on his Twitter account. He tweeted, this was hours ago, so funny to watch the fake news, especially NBC and CNN. They are fighting hard to downplay the deal with North Korea. 500 days ago would have, quote, begged for this deal. Looked like war would break out. Our country's biggest enemy is fake news, so easily promulgated by fools. Okay. Now, let's talk about this a little bit. You go back to the CNN headline, and the CNN headline is, after meeting with North Korean dictator, Trump calls press America's biggest enemy. That's not what President Trump said. This would be considered, quote, fake news. That's not what Trump was talking about. What President Trump was talking about were members of the press who put out lies or mislead people, like this headline right here when President Trump said the fake news is the biggest enemy of the American people. Brian Stelter of CNN took that as the press is the biggest enemy of the American people. That's not what the president said. The president didn't say Fox News, Politico, the New York Times, the Washington Post. He said fake news and singled out NBC and CNN, which have been giving him pretty bad news coverage. Let's be honest about this. Now, what is Brian Stelter really trying to get across to you? That Trump is just as bad as Kim Jong-un, because Kim Jong-un doesn't like the press. That's why in this story, the headline is, after meeting with North Korean dictator, Trump calls press America's biggest enemy. Trump has been going after fake news since day one, Brian. He isn't just now going after fake news, and he isn't going after all members of the press. This isn't some type of authoritarian crackdown on the press at all. It's a shame that Brian Stelter and others at CNN will put this kind of story out there and say that Trump called the American press America's biggest enemy. That's not what he said. He said the fake news is America's biggest enemy. I could spend a whole nother video talking about whether or not that's actually true, whether or not the fake news, false news, lying news is America's biggest enemy. But I can tell you this. It doesn't help out this country when you have so many people who are anti-Trump, a deep-seated hatred of Trump, and they're the ones putting out the news and slanting the news in a way that is anti-Trump. If Barack Obama had gone overseas and participated in talks with Kim Jong-un the press would have loved it. CNN would have gone crazy nuts. MSNBC would have loved it. NBC would have loved it. Everybody would have loved it. They would have called Obama a hero. But Trump goes over there and automatically, no matter what he does, he's going to be wrong. This hit piece out from Brian Stelter at CNN is absolutely false. The president of the United States did not say the press was the greatest enemy of the American people. The president said the fake news is the greatest enemy of the American people. Whether that's correct or not, I'll save that for a later video and probably talk about it on the show tomorrow. But again, this is another example of a dishonest headline that is attention grabbing and not real. Tune in to the Chad HD Show weekday mornings, 8:30 to 11 a.m. Central Time on News Talk 95.1 FM and 790 AM KFYO.